Well, hello everyone. This is Jamie Silver with Herf Jones Yearbooks. Welcome to the Yearbook podcast and the October episode. And for this month, we are going to cover primarily one topic because this time of year, photography is a big deal. It's my passion. It's how I got involved in Yearbook, and I want to share a presentation with you. So we're going to jump into that, and that will be most of the episode today. But I did want to share two reminders. One update, our tech support hotline that you may be familiar with when you have tech-related questions. And if you can't reach Sarah or myself, you're also welcome to call one of our folks in tech support. And we have expanded hours now this time of year, starting at 6 a.m. until 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. So call all of us. As you know, Sarah, myself, and all these folks in tech support are all here as a team to support you. So, never hesitate to call. And the other reminder is this time of the year are covers. So we need to really focus on getting that cover done. Many of you, we've already talked, but if we haven't talked yet about your cover, let's chat soon. And if we can help you in any way, if you want to pick one of ours, or you have a design that you're ready to submit, or you'd like us to help you with that, let me know. We can also do a virtual art session if you'd like. So let me know if you have any questions on that. And again, we're going to jump into this photo presentation. It is about a class period, so it's about 48 minutes here, but it covers all the basics of photography. I hope you find it helpful, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you. So today I'd like to share this presentation with you on the topic of photography. And for those of you who know me, you know that this is one of my favorite topics on Yearbook. In fact, it's how I got involved with Yearbook as a student in both a middle school and high school, being the student photographer. So I love sharing this. I've shared this presentation by request several times with schools, and I thought I'd make a video on it so we can share it whenever it's convenient for you to watch. So with that said, we are going to talk about cameras and photos here today. Now I'm going to start off by saying there's two main topics, skills and gear, and really for this presentation we are going to be focusing on techniques rather than the tools. Now, I'll pause on that and add, for those of you who know me, you also know I love camera gear. I love equipment. I love cameras, gadgets, and seeing what they can do to elevate my photography. With that said, that stuff will always come and go. It will always change, evolve, and get better over time. But none of that matters unless we have the basic techniques. And that's why I'm focusing on that in this presentation. So don't get me wrong. I love cameras. If you have any questions about camera settings, and we're going to talk about a couple very broad topics here today, but feel free to reach out and we can talk more offline as well. To illustrate that, I did put up these two photos here on the screen, both of which I took at very different times, very different equipment. And the example here I'm trying to make is, I took this back with a 35 millimeter basic film camera back in the day, and then most recently this with my current DSLR digital. So you'll notice, it's clear that the new stuff is better, right? Technology gets better, lenses are better, sensors are better than film and film speed and all that. But my point in sharing these two is they're both good photos, and there will always be something better. So, quick story, when I took this one most recently, and this is equipment that I've, added over time, and when I have money saved up to get another lens or whatnot, kind of slowly add over the decades, I'm dating myself, to the camera bag. As I took this photo, standing next to me was a professional photographer from the local paper, and I was chatting with him a little bit, and he probably had a good $30,000 worth of camera gear on his person to shoot the track meet. So my point here is there's always something better. It's frankly, not obtainable for all of us listening to this video because it's really for the pros who use it for bigger events. So my point here is you can always make what you have work. And my goal today is to focus on techniques rather than those tools to squeeze the best out of it. And frankly, sometimes, a phrase I heard from a fellow photographer was the best camera is the one in your pocket. In today's world, that's often our iPhone or Android device that has a pretty good camera on it. So, you can get a lot out of something like that. And obviously, there's pros and cons. What I call a real camera, a DSLR with a nice lens on is always better. But again, it's a slippery slope. So my goal here is to focus on some basics. And then we can talk one-on-one, and I'm happy to help you, with specific camera settings. Today, we're not talking about, Nikon versus Canon versus Sony, because frankly, they're all good. I don't have a strong preference one or the other. I simply shoot Nikon because that's always what I did, and therefore the equipment can just grow in time. So a lot of the stuff I have is old and some of the stuff is new, but it all works together because it's one. That's the only reason I stay with Nikon. I'm not here to say it's better or worse than any other, but it's just consistency with, equipment working together. So that's about it for equipment today. We're going to talk about some basics. At the end, we will talk about some general rule of thumbs for settings on different topics shooting at school. So today we're going to talk about center of interest, varying angles, depth of field. I bolded that because that's my favorite topic and a really cool technique that we're going to show some examples on. Leading lines, pattern and repetition, capturing peak of emotion, because that's really here on Yearbook, or if you're on newspaper watching, that's what it's all about. We're trying to tell a story through images. So capturing that peak of emotion is important. Rule of thirds and framing. So composing good photos. We're going to talk a lot of different topics. And the first one I put up here is never stand and shoot, right? So I would say, back to that camera bag analogy, the best piece of equipment you guys have is actually your feet. It's not the camera, it's not the lens, it's moving around and getting different perspectives. Find high and low angles to isolate your center of interest and just capture those different perspectives. And generally, those straight-on pictures, generally, that's what everyone does, call it a snapshot, if you will. But generally, those are less pleasing than the higher angle or the lower angle. So look at varying your angles. Shooting from below, makes the subject appear larger in the foreground. We're going to look at some examples. And the same is true above, makes the subject look smaller, the opposite. Here are some quick examples from one of our workshops in the past. This photo here, I was more or less, on the ground pointing up with my camera to get that low angle. This one, I believe I was on a chair to get kind of the, that higher angle looking down. And this one's just a general shot, right? It's not bad. It's just to show you the differences between the high, low, and just your standard angle. But these are really good. A wide angle basic shot as an establishing shot to show what's going on, where these really focus on the detail. Here's another great example. And by the way, as we go through this, you're going to see some really cool photos from students all over the U.S. that we've noted here who took the photo, and some of mine did as well. But this is a really cool low angle shot, giving the photo depth with the foot close in the foreground. Okay, so depth of field, some terms. Depth of field creates that perspective, and by definition, it's really how much of the photo is in focus. And we're going to look at some examples. Here's a photo I took at graduation a couple years ago, and this is what's referred to as a very shallow or narrow, you'll hear both ways, a very shallow depth of field, meaning I opened up the lens aperture all the way, which gives you one plane of focus. I focused on the student's eyes. You always kind of want to focus in on their eyes. So this makes sure their eyes are razor sharp, and then everything in front of this graduate and everything behind goes blurry, intentional. This is that depth of field. This is why I love, as I highlighted on the first slide, depth of field really lets you isolate your subject and give the photo a real professional look, and it's really just a basic camera function by opening the aperture all the way. Here's another example. I took this with the first, I'll call it real lens I bought. This is probably a good 10 years ago, and unfortunately, the real lenses, as I jokingly say, are ones with fast aperture. So a wide open lens, same thing here, focus on the eye of the bird, and right in that plane of focus, you got some water droplets in focus, and then everything in front and everything in back goes blurry intentionally to give the photo some depth. Another great example, more practical to what we're going to do for Yearbook, senior photo kind of thing, or you might do a call out or an editorial on a student. Same thing here, wide open lens, focused right on her eye, and everything in front and in back goes blurry. And it's the wall right here, which is on the same plane, is sharp in focus. And that really draws attention to the main subject of the photo. Okay, leading lines, much like when I just showed you with the doorknob and the brick wall, this helps the eye follow patterns to the center of interest, especially from the foreground to the background. So much like when I just showed you with the wall, kind of leading your eye into the student's face and going, soft focus on the back. Here's a literal leading line, Cub Scouts with the rope coming in and leading your eye to the students. Same thing with the boat, leading lines to the subject. Okay, composing good photos continued. We're going to talk about simplicity. You really want to try to isolate your subject and crop, as it says here, before you snap. So you really want to get close in on your main subject. So change perspective as necessary to reduce that background clutter, and don't be afraid to fill the frame. You're going to see a continuous pattern here in this presentation about moving closer, 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 because the closer you get to your subject and using various techniques to highlight that subject, it tells a story of that person. And in our world, the action at school, whether it's an athletic event or whatnot, but you want to really isolate that part of the picture to tell the story. Great example of those leading lines that seem to fly away from the focal point, the welding. Really cool image. Okay, so now we're going to look at patterns, repetition, and more about angles. So patterns draw the eye in, right? It breaks the repetition and provides that pop and brings you again to the focus of that image and the draw of that photo. So examples of that: stairs, lanes, rows, all these things can create that repeated drum, and you're going to see an example of that in a second. And then you disrupt it with the subject, so you draw their attention to that. So again, experiment with different angles, high and low. Here's a simple example of that. With the basketball players, they're all looking one way, same jersey. You got that pattern, the leading line going off into the distance, and then you have that one student turned around facing the camera, drawing your eye into that one student. Here's a literal angle, right? So for those of you listening, if you've been involved in shooting with drones at all, it's kind of a new thing. It's a fad, right? Everyone's doing it right now. The way I look at it is it's just a really cool, really tall tripod. It lets you get that different perspective that you couldn't otherwise get in the past. So might make a separate video on that, but if anyone's interested in more information about drones, please feel free to contact me. I'd love to share with you. It's been a learning process for me to follow the ever-changing regulations and follow the rules, and I earned my license with the FAA because that's what you're supposed to do, and there's a lot of rules that come along with it. But here's a really simple example of an elevated perspective and just giving you a different view of a pretty normal picture of your school, right? But getting up to, this is only like 100 feet, but getting a different point of view. Okay, so we have the seated graduates in this image that have that pattern during their hats, and then your eyes, with this one student standing up throwing the cap, it breaks that pattern and draws your attention in. More on composing good photos. We talked about in the beginning, peak of emotion. We're telling a story, so you want to make sure you capture the emotion that tells that story, and that can be both the action and also the reaction. So put yourself at a game, whatever that game might be. Obviously you're going to get the action on the field, but you also want to spin around and get the fans, for example, as a reaction. So this image, draws you in. It's a split second. I took this, golfing and being able to capture the emotion on his face. I got lucky, or I just took a lot of photos, honestly, to capture the ball in midair because that moves fast. But I also see the sand kind of flying up as he's, getting out of the sand trap. So just an example of drawing, showing emotion and capturing motion very quickly. Again, fast shutter speed lets you help you stop that. This image draws you in as these two teammates, high five and jump in the air, and you'll note the note on the bottom left corner. We'll talk more about that later, but this is a photo illustration using selective color, and I use that technique to also draw your eye into those two players, and black and white on all the others to kind of fade that into the background a little bit. Obvious picture here, right? Action, reaction of the other players. I think this is cool. I'm always amazed watching the gymnastics meets and how the strength that goes into this. So obviously we're catching him holding on there, and then framing wise, we have the coach looking up, and you see his hand is ready to catch him just in case. So just a cool image of showing the action and reaction. Now, this, again, storytelling. I'm hoping that this image helps tell that story. I knew it would need a caption possibly to add to it in the yearbook, but the point here is, this student walking away with her hands on her head, she thought she made a goal, but the goalie, as you see him walking away, just told her otherwise, and that's her reaction to that. So again, capturing emotion and reaction. Okay, rule of thirds. So this is one of those basics, right? So imagine a tic-tac-toe board in your viewfinder. And by the way, this you can turn on most mobile phones. Again, back to using our phones as cameras. It's usually labeled a grid. You just turn it on and it does it for you, so you can see it in the viewfinder. And most cameras really do it too. You just have to turn it on so you see it in the viewfinder. But what you want to do is place your main subject at the intersection of one of these points. And you're going to see an example here in a second. And you generally want to allow the subject to face into the center of the image. So what we're going to do is we're going to put up this tic-tac-toe board so you see what I mean. And where those points intersect, highlighted with the red circles, is generally, rule of thumb, where you want to place your subject. So I'm going to flip through a couple examples here and then put that tic-tac-toe board up. And now I'm going to show some without the board just to illustrate. And once you start thinking this way as you're shooting and looking at that visual, that tool on the screen to where those intersections meet and placing your subject there, it just becomes natural for you to do so. So for example, this graduate here, the tendency as you're learning photography in the beginning, the tendency is to just put your subject dead center. And as we said in the beginning, that's generally not what you want to do. You actually want to put them at one of those intersections of the rule of thirds. So this one is very clear as you imagine that tic-tac-toe board. Her face is right in the middle of that. This dad at graduation, he's a little off, but generally right where that tic-tac would go. Same here, same here. And again with the flying camera, the drone, same with the water tower there. So just some other examples of rule of thirds. Okay. Now we're going to talk about framing, using structures and nature and shadows to create frames for your subject to help tell that story. So framing can also create that depth of field, that perspective. We're going to look at some examples of that here. So this one I took looking through lattice at an outdoor event. It was another student gathering, and I kind of moved a little bit with the camera, again my feet, to get this one student framed up within this framework. The only thing, if I could retake this photo, we talked about simplicity. I would have preferred, and maybe I should have stood there longer to wait for it to happen, that some of these students were either not here or turned around, again, just to draw attention to the main subject. So there's one example of that. This one is awesome. I didn't take this photo. I wish I had. This is beautiful. Framing the picture like this. That's just awesome. Again, you could just get full frame of the picture, but how cool is this? And it helps tell the story a little bit better. This one was from the drone as well. And we have students down in the field creating the shape. They do this every year. We do it for the end sheets once in a while. And having the fire truck come up on this long arm, and the photographer is actually here taking the photo, and the fireman's looking back because I kind of caught him off guard. So you got to be careful with that. We told everyone but the fireman, and he heard the buzzing camera behind him. So anyway, but using this to kind of frame the photo and give it some depth, as you can imagine, if this weren't here, it would just be this wide angle shot of the students down there. Having this in the foreground gives the image more depth. Okay, here's a photo checklist, things to look for both while you're shooting and then reviewing your photos later so you can tweak your approach next time you go out. You want to make sure your colors are vivid, your subject is clear and sharp. We've talked a lot about blurry backgrounds and foregrounds intentionally, but those unintentional blurs you want to avoid, obviously. Clean and crisp. Caution using higher ISO. Again, more about camera settings. We can talk more about that if you're interested. But the end result there is as that ISO number goes up, the images tend to get grainier. Make sure your center of interest is clear. We've talked a lot about that and drawing the eye to the main event, the subject of the image. And then, capturing that action and reaction. Again, telling that story. No mergers. So make sure objects are not growing from someone's head. Simple example of this, and it happens sometimes, but say you're on the field and you're shooting soccer and the goalpost is behind one of the players, and when you look at the photo later, you'll notice the goalpost is coming directly out of their head. Obviously, at a fast-paced game like that, it just happens by mistake, and we take lots of photos. We just pick the one that doesn't have that. But more something that you might be working on staging more, let's say a club photo, if you will, for the yearbook. You want to make sure when you line the students up that if you do it outside, for example, you don't have a tree or a flagpole coming out of someone's head. So just look out for mergers. Now, this photograph is really cool by a student in California here, and this photo uses a slow shutter speed to create this blur and give it that dramatic look in the background of those leading lines. So what this is this student, I certainly couldn't do this, this student is holding still for a long time, really, in reality, because those lines are taillights of a car or cars. So by slowing down the camera shutter, we're allowing those cars to drive through the background of the scene and create that blur effect. Really cool. And the subject just needs to hold still while doing so. Now, again, I didn't take this photo, so I don't know for sure, but this might have also used the flash to freeze the action here, possibly. Something to consider. Okay, understanding the sun and using it to our advantage, because sometimes it can be a challenge. In the sun, direct sunlight, as you all know, puts direct shadows on people's faces, and it makes us squint, right? If you've ever been on the other side of the team, or other side of the picture, I should say, while someone's taking a photo, you're staring at the sun, you're squinting, you have shadows. If you're sweaty, if it's hot out, it's highlighting that. So you want to avoid, basically, if you can, the middle of the day, the direct sun. And when possible, move that group, subject, whatever it is, under some shade. Maybe use a tree for shade. We're going to look at an example here in a second. And also, if you need to, use a fill flash to help soften those shadows. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. That indirect sunlight, found under the tree, for example, really helps soften that look. You remove some of the shadows. So when you can, you want to really pull people under a tree to do a photograph. Here's a quick example of that. As you might imagine, if I'd taken this picture just in the middle of the day with the sky, all of this background image here would be really, really bright, and their faces would likely be very dark just because of the extreme difference between the direct sun and their face in the shadow. So by walking these students over to the tree, the photographer was able to reduce that ratio, we'll talk about that in a minute, and get the ratio closer so we could actually see their face. So again, overcast is your friend. It might be counterintuitive if photography is new to you, but those hazy or cloudy days are actually the best days to photograph, right? Because it gives you that nice, soft, diffused light and distributes it rather than that direct sun that gives you those, harsh shadows, makes people squint. Sunrise and sunset are also ideal. Gives you a nice color. We're going to look at that in a second. Another option for backlighting a subject and more drama is putting the sun to someone's back. Now you got to be careful with that because sometimes it overpowers, but here's a quick example of that here. It's kind of cool. It also gives you that shadow to play with, as well as this little outline that we refer to as backlighting around their heads. So, try to do that too. Again, you're going to take many photos of an event, but sometimes putting the sun behind their back can work out really well, like this example shows. Okay, talking about time. So again, noon is the worst. It's just hard, right? It's the harshest light in the middle of the day, and you just want to kind of avoid that. Again, using flash or shade to help diffuse or soften that light. Morning and afternoon, earlier and latter part of the days are better, right? And it gives you that optimum exposure with warmer tones. And I mentioned we were going to show an example, I think this was sunset, sunrise, and just giving you that warmer tone with the sun. So as you see it on his face, it's just a nice color, got the nice shadow behind him. It's a pretty good example. Also, if you notice, it really demonstrates that rule of thirds as well. Okay, now we're going to talk about lighting ratio. I mentioned it earlier, and I want to explain it in a little bit more detail. So the lighting ratio compares the amount of light in the shadow areas to the light areas, okay? Because our eyes and our brain can see both, okay? But a camera isn't capable of doing that. When it sees harsh light, and this is a prime example, or this window here, maybe a little more clear, or the school bus here, where there's really extremes, right? So on the school bus, the sky is really bright and it's really dark down here. The camera cannot record, whether it's film or digital in our current technology. In one picture, it cannot record all extremes, even though the human eye can. So there's a couple ways to address that. One is obviously changing a lighting environment, which we talked about, direct sun versus shade or fill flash. The other, and this is often referred to now as HDR, and it stands for high dynamic range, I believe. And essentially what it does is it lets the camera, and by the way, the iPhone and probably Android actually has a button on it that says HDR, and you can turn this feature on and it does all the magic for you. What it does is it takes multiple exposures and blends them together. And these are examples of that, right? We have an overexposed, a normal, and an underexposed. And this is exactly what the iPhone, for example, and I only speak to that because that's what I use, but I'm assuming Android devices do the same thing. What it's doing is it's taking this overexposed, okay, where this is just all white, we can't see any detail, the underexposed, where you can start to see what's through that bright part, the window, and right in the middle, and it blends it into one image called an HDR image. Here's another example of that. And this, if you're at school taking pictures, this is more analogous to, say, a group photo and they happen to be standing in front of a window, which we want to avoid doing. But if it happens, here's how to deal with it. HDR is one solution, redirecting and using flash and all that primarily, but this is one option to look at. If this were a classroom environment in this picture, most likely this outside view through the window and the door would just be white, right? Because it's so bright outside, so much darker inside, that ratio is so off that the camera can't record it. HDR takes a bunch of images, as I explained here, and combines it into one so we can actually see both the inside and the outside. And same with the school bus example here. Really dark, middle, too light, and merges it into one. Now I just Googled these, and this school bus one is actually a good example of sometimes HDR doesn't work so well. And I've noticed this on my phone as well. When I take an image, sometimes it looks fake. And this is a good example of, honestly, this probably a bad example of HDR, but I want to share it because sometimes when it does its algorithm and whatever it does, the end result is not good. This is one example of that. This image almost looks embossed, or it just looks fake. So sometimes it doesn't work well. So that low ratio is when the background, when we'll have both having detail, okay? So that window example, when the ratio is low, that means there isn't this huge gap between bright and dark. And that's where the camera can record it well. That high ratio is where you're going to lose detail in one or the other because it's just too drastic between the two. Some examples of that. High ratio at the top, low ratio at the bottom. This is an old photo I took in high school, black and white film days, but the same thing holds true. As the high jumper is going, you'll see the sky, you can barely see it. It's just totally white. Same here with this picture, but I tried to fix it with HDR. The school bus is darker than outside, and that's actually a school building. Before using HDR, this was just white, so it kind of brings that in. Same thing here. From the helicopter, the drone, it does this already. It does the HDR for us, and it kind of blends the images together so we get the bright sky and the ground all exposed correctly. This example is not HDR. This was just me on my feet moving the camera a little bit to make sure the background behind, for the senior photo sitting wasn't too drastic. So, I deliberately positioned the trees and the color, in this case because it was fall, to make sure that these were all properly exposed and she wasn't too dark and the background wasn't the bright sky. Okay, adding light. So now we're going to talk about flash. I don't use flash a lot, personally. I prefer to work with available light, natural light, but sometimes, in the examples you've seen, we need to do so. So it can add that artificial light when there isn't enough. Now, this is an example up here, and again, I just got this on Google. This is where we're not using any flash and it's just direct sun, all those shadows we talked about. This is direct flash, basically on autopilot. What it's doing is it's throwing a lot of light at the subject's face. Sometimes it's fine, sometimes it's not, because it just makes them so bright, stark white, and the background goes black. And you can see how the background starts to go black. This example, as it says, is a softbox flash. So some settings we do on the flash unit, whether it's on the camera or built in, to basically turn the power down so it puts less light out. And then a softbox is literally, a diffuser that you put over the flash to give it a softer view or a softer look instead of this harsh light. So as you can see, it helps to fill in the shadows, and when done right, it also, the fill flash doesn't allow the backdrop to go as dark as it would if it's just on autopilot. So that's fill flash. Again, as we talked, it fills the shadows. And here's a good note to remember, flash doesn't work very far. So if you are using flash, keep in mind it really only travels from you to your subject, and this is generous, 5 to 15 feet. It doesn't go very far. More expensive flashes are more powerful and they go further, but generally you need to be relatively close to your subject when using a flash. So just keep that in mind. Really cool example of some pretty fancy flash units, strobes. And obviously this is not during an actual swim meet. It's during practice or a photo shoot kind of thing that you might do for your book. But they're really cool, right? And it's a lot of flash power to freeze the action. The droplets are frozen. And again, the background goes black. You can't see the rest of the pool, which is fine. This might be a really cool divider picture, right? For athletics or something like that. Okay. I said we're not going to talk about cameras too much, but we are going to talk some basic settings that apply to everyone. So we're not speaking to Nikon or Canon or Sony. Again, this is just general settings. So for action shots, and generally speaking, this is just my personal preference, I tend to shoot an aperture priority, which means I set my aperture, the f-stop, and the camera matches the appropriate shutter speed. Okay? So generally speaking, for action shots, you need to have the largest aperture possible. And I simply say that rather than quoting you a number like f2.8, because that will depend on your lens. Remember, the goal here is to squeeze as much out of the equipment you have without going into a budget that's just unobtainable. Okay? So the largest aperture on your lens, whatever that might be, is basically the f-stop number and the smallest number you can achieve. For example, a common one is like f3.5 on a lens that might come with a camera that you buy as a kit. The smaller the number, the better to freeze action and to yield that shallow depth of field you've seen me show examples of. So again, largest aperture, the smallest f-stop number you can do on your camera is what you're looking for action shots. So turn that dial all the way to 1.8, 2.8 would be awesome. It just, those lenses tend to cost more money. So if it's 3.5 or 4, whatever that number is, the smallest number will help you achieve that. And then after you shoot, review your photographs. I do this to this day to analyze. And if you're using a digital camera, it's already recording all this for you. You just open it up in Lightroom or Photos that I use on the Mac or Photoshop, and it's probably recording your f-stop for you, your shutter speed for you, your ISO, so you can review that information later as you come back and look at your photos. So for example, the golf pictures you saw, the soccer pictures, look at those later after the shoot is done. And if the soccer ball is a little bit blurry, like the one I shared earlier, reference what time of day it was, how sunny it was, and your shutter speed. And then just make a mental note for next time you guys go out and shoot that you'll need a slightly faster shutter speed to freeze the action. Golf, that little ball is very fast. So you need to look at that shutter speed and accommodate for that fast moving ball if you want to freeze it like in the picture I shared earlier. So again, just look at all those options that you set on the camera in a review phase to see what happened, why. So next time you go out, you can just make a couple little tweaks and see how that changes it. We've covered this. It requires the fast shutter speed to freeze the action. The downside. everything in photography usually has a give and take, right? The downside to that, depending on all other things like your lens and how fast it is to achieve that faster shutter speed, you often need to increase the ISO or flash. Generally speaking, especially if we're talking sports, you guys aren't allowed to use flash as it distracts the players. So that's usually off the board. But usually, in order to speed up that shutter speed, to freeze the action, we're going to have to increase that ISO number, a larger number. You may recall in the beginning I mentioned the blurry, right? Or images that don't look sharp. Unfortunately, the trade-off there is once you start going too high, that'll just depend on your camera, but too high with this ISO number, the images start to look grainy. So there's a trade-off there. Okay, so basic settings for a group photo. This is the opposite, right? Fast shutter speed is not important. In fact, we don't want it because the downside, right, to that fast shutter speed on all the sports photos I shared with you are you have one thing in focus, your primary subject, and everything in front and in back is blurry, which is really cool for fill in the blank athletic event, but it's really terrible for a group photo because we want all those rows of people in focus. So if you're shooting a group photo, say club day at school, and you need to get a picture of all the clubs, and you line students up in a row and many rows, and they go maybe 3-4 rows back, you actually want the exact opposite, right? You want to close down the lens, and then just a general reference point, f8 or higher on the camera, so larger number on the f-stop, to therefore give more depth, more in focus, right? So we want all the rows in focus. So we're going to close this down to allow the focus to be greater. Instead of just one thing razor sharp and everything else front and back blurry, this will give more things in focus. So you want to do that to make sure the rows are in focus. What I want to highlight here with this picture at the bottom is the idea of a pinhole camera. So let me jump to that. Because once you master these two functions, which is shutter speed and aperture, you can really control everything in photography. It's really cool. And to illustrate how simple that is, your camera basically does two things, right? You have aperture and shutter speed. Everything else are bells and whistles. And again, you heard me say this at the beginning, I love those bells and whistles, and they're fun to play with and see how they can tweak images and capabilities a little bit. But in the end, a camera, no matter what camera you guys have, does two things, aperture and shutter speed. How large is the opening on the lens, and how long is that open? And to illustrate that, if you guys want to Google or go on YouTube specifically, pinhole camera for a fun project. This is an example, and I did this when I was in photo class in high school myself. It's literally like a Kleenex box or an Amazon box today, and you paint it black inside, you seal it off, you literally poke a hole in it with a pin, that's the aperture, and then you put a little piece of tape or something over the front to open it up and allow light into the box. That's your shutter speed, and you emulate what a camera does. Again, everything else is just icing on the cake, and it's great, and it lets you do a lot of cool things by all the gadgets they've added to it, HDR being a great example of that, that a pinhole doesn't do. It's very basic, but if you want a fun project to do at school, on Yearbook staff, or just at home, just Google that, and you'll see some videos about how it works. It's pretty cool, and it really illustrates how simple a camera should be. I think we've often complicated it, and it's harder to learn when you look at a camera, a modern camera, and you see all these dials and all these settings, and there's a sports button and a flower button and a mountains button sometimes, and it gets confusing. I think it's a really cool exercise to just see the basics of photography. Even if you don't do it, you can Google it. There's other options for you to make like a viewing box, if you will. And again, you'll see that on YouTube. But it just helps you understand those two basic functions, aperture and shutter speed. Okay, so photo variety and telling that story. You want to set the setting. You want to transport your viewer, set the scene. This is where we talk about those establishing shots. If you remember from the beginning of the presentation here, we talked about that activity where I was on the ground looking up at the students, building that structure, looking down, and then that general wide shot, setting the scene. That general wide shot is still good, so you establish what's happening. And they should, describe the overall environment. Again, angles. We talked a lot about that. And introduce folks to the people, in the activity, whatever that might be. You want to tell the story of each person. And get closer, no closer, as it says here. I mentioned that's a kind of a repeating element here. You want to get closer because there's nothing worse than standing far back, standing in one place, getting this, frankly, boring, wide picture, right? And that's all you get. You really want to move around. You've heard me talk about the feet. Best tool in your camera bag. Move around, get different perspectives, but also get closer to the action and fill that frame. Cropping is very important. We already talked about that, the crowd shot. Always look for people standing out and, getting reactions to the action. Really cool example here. Showing them primary action, obviously, but you can see people in the background, even though it's a little blurry on purpose. But you froze an action and reaction to people cheering on. So on that reaction, you want to focus on, faces, gestures, postures. Get closer. You want to capture emotion, right? All of us in the room, even if there's some watching this video on newspaper staff or yearbook, we're all trying to do the same thing. We're trying to tell that story. So get closer. Good point to stick around. A lot of the photos I've got at, especially athletic events, you get the conclusion of the game. You get that winning shot. Really cool. Too often than not, you walk away. And I can tell you from experience, sticking around for a little bit, helping tell that story of the reaction to the game on both teams, you get some really cool emotion to capture. So stick around. And capture the event as it happens. You're going to get people in the stands, screaming, jumping, all that fun stuff. Be patient. You want to get the, that climax of action, the last second shots, or the kiss at the school play kind of thing. Now, shooting during practices and rehearsals, great. I did that a lot when I was a student because you can get, theater, for example, you can get right up on stage, ask first, of course, but you can get right up on stage, just caption such, so we know when it's printed in the book that this was a rehearsal or a practice. If you remember back to the picture I shared of the high jumper, that was not during a meet. That was a practice. And I went out with my buddies and I asked them if they would do that a few times so I could capture it on film. So sometimes you get some really good images that way because you can control the environment more. It's just right to caption it such. Again, angles and perspectives we've talked about. So here are just more examples of golf and showing narrow depth of field, shallow depth of field. I like stuff like this when I'm shooting to use as maybe a background for a yearbook page or a graphic element. It's a golf ball. It's not even the player, but you never know when you might want to use something like that. Again, same. Personally, I took this one. I don't like how she's dead center. Again, rule of thirds. I would have preferred she be over here, but the ball is frozen in action. That's kind of cool. This one's framed a little bit better where she's standing. You can see her face. You can still see the ball. Watching in, and framing it with the equipment and looking through. Capturing the event. Now, again, for those of you who know me, I'm not a big sports fan. However, when the Cubs won, I took some time off and I went down to this parade because it was the coolest thing ever. Talk about emotion and capturing emotion. Really cool event. This kind of image is the obvious one, holding that. I liked this pattern with this one person in the middle smiling and kind of stands out from all the others. Some basic framing with the trees and water tower and just showing the mass quantity of people, reaction to the action. And I always think these are kind of interesting shots to get. You don't always use them, but it's kind of cool to have because it's part of our world now. We all have our phones, and they're always on when they're an event. So I like to usually capture at least one image of someone taking a photo through the phone from their perspective. Again, more examples of framing and narrow depth of field. Same graduation you've seen photos from earlier where they're blurred out, but this time I focused on the parents watching the event. Turning around and capturing friends, hollering behind me and reaction to the event. And these two images I put in to show perspective and, again, using your feet to get where you need to be. The typical place to stand at graduation, if you haven't shot before, it can be a little bit intimidating and you don't want to, disrupt things, and you certainly want to get permission to do so. But typically you want to stand in, you might be standing in the back or the sidelines, and you'll get the back of the graduates, which is fine for some photos, but how cool is it to get from their perspective? So, I was basically, for these two images, standing right behind the principal and the administration. I asked them first to let them know I'd be there shooting for Yearbook, and you get their faces of the graduates and their experience receiving their diplomas in the flower. So again, perspective and moving to the right place in the room to capture that. Okay. So we've talked a lot about variety in telling the story, the scene setters, those detail shots, getting really close that words may not be able to capture. Look for those small moments, behind the scenes, quiet emotion, close portraits, getting close for a third time, getting close, and work with that wide open aperture to reduce the depth of field. You've heard me say that a few times and show examples, and I hope those have helped illustrate why I like it so much. Having that narrow depth of field really, draws attention to your subject. More examples of that. Again, narrow depth of field, blurry, sharp, blurry, a little bit if there are more people here. Same thing with the graduate holding the tassel out, sharp, blurry, giving it depth. Same thing, moving my feet to get behind the graduate this time and getting this really, fun reaction of the principal looking at the student. Must have been a backstory there, an inside joke. And then looking over the graduates again, different perspectives, seeing the audience. Just more examples of a graduation showing different perspectives, detail, right? So you got the hats, you got throwing the caps, joking around afterwards, holding our diplomas. Again, the phone shot, wide angle shot, looking over someone's shoulder is fun. Okay. Well, now we're going to talk about ethics very briefly, but it's really important. So, because digital photography is really just the way it is. When I learned photography, it was in the darkroom, and it was a lot harder to make changes to photo, and it was just more involved in time. Now it's easy. We can all do this on our iPhone or computer in Photoshop. So it's just become normal. But it's brought the question of photo ethics. So you really need to just consider this because we're in the world of yearbook and newspaper, and we're looking at images that are recording history and being printed for a long time. So photo ethics, in short, you really don't want to alter without clarification. So if you think back to that photo I shared where I mentioned there's a photo illustration and labeled such on the bottom because I made it black and white through some color correction and all that, you can do so, but you need to note it. Clearly label it, as I did in that example, as a photo illustration. And you want to explain how it's changed. So I said photo illustration with color selection, or selective color, I think I put in the caption. Now contouring is what we talked about with HDR, and this example again that we looked at with the high jumper. So as he's jumping over the bar, is an old photo, right? Black and white. The exposure is good, but it's all bright up here. So it has been considered acceptable to what's called contouring the photo, and that's where HDR comes in, or other techniques of bringing the sky in more, because the camera, again, can't record it, but the human eye can. So, and really, we're bringing this photo by contouring the image and, correcting that somehow, technique, HDR or otherwise, and making the sky show up more. That's considered acceptable still. Because it really doesn't alter reality. That's really what happened. That's really what we saw when we watched this happen in real life, but the camera wasn't able to record it. We kind of fixed it, Photoshop or whatever, and that's still considered acceptable. But what we don't want to do is misrepresent reality, right? It's now a thing to say Photoshop it and adding a missing person to a group photo. That is clearly considered unethical in our world of journalism, because it misrepresents reality. So we really, really don't want to do that. For fun, for your own use, have fun. I do it too. And this morphing and distorting features for fun, that's fine for just personal use, but it's not something we should be doing and then reproducing and sharing in a yearbook or newspaper. That's really, really considered unethical. So you want to make sure you don't do that. Really, the bottom line is altering reality. You shouldn't do that in our world of yearbooking. So you just want to look at how the camera viewed it. And if it's easy to contour the photo, fix the photo back to reality because the camera was the limiting factor there, that's fine. But we really don't want to be adding people to group pictures or morphing people's faces. That's just not what we should be doing, in student journalism. So, as a team, these are pictures from Hinsdale South. I hope you guys don't mind me sharing last year at distribution, but as a group, you guys watching, you are recording history at your school. So let's get out there and capture and tell that story of your school year together. And between storytelling via captions and writing, blended with photo storing via photos, you can do that even more. So thank you for watching. I hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. Talk to you soon. Thank you.